was press spokesman for George W. Bush's 2004 campaign, and was a senior advisor and spokesman for Mitt Romney's 2012 U.S. presidential campaign. He also frequently appears on national news and talk shows, magazines, and newspapers as a political pundit and public relations professional. Currently, he works as the Executive Vice President of Advocacy for Arnold Ventures. Tonight, Kevin will lend his insight and his firsthand experience to tell us about what it's like to work inside a presidential campaign, his thoughts on the upcoming 2020 presidential elections, and what he sees for the future of the Republican Party moving forward. As always, during American Public Square programming, we welcome questions from the audience. As roving reporter, I will be watching for any questions you may have for Kevin. So please feel free to type those into the Q&A section of Zoom. If you are watching through Facebook, you may also ask your questions by posting them on our official APS page. With that, I will turn it over to our moderator for the evening.
Thank you very much, Adam. And Kevin, welcome. I'd like to welcome you back to American Public Square. You were kind enough to join us. I think it's been about a year and a half. We did a program on fake news, of all things. And here we are back again. And I think that and we've had yours is the third in a series. We started with Jeff Berman talking about the delegate process on the Democratic Party. Tom McMahon talked to us about the use of social media in campaigns. So what we're really looking to hear from you about tonight is you have had a senior role in the Romney campaign in 2012. Sort of, if you will, from your biography, sort of the culmination of your hands-on involved in politics, having started with Leader DeLay back in the probably in the 90s at some point.
Oh, you're dating me. That was the 2005, 2007.
Oh, you were a latecomer. Okay, I remember what you came in the 90s. It's a different. It's showing my age. That's all. So talk a little about if this were a normal year, which it clearly isn't. If this were a normal presidential campaign, which it clearly isn't, if you were in the position you were in with Mitt Romney in 2012, what would your life be like?
Well, the thing that I always joke about when I talk about when I think back to the memories of campaigns, if I were to write a book about working on a presidential campaign, the title would be "Begging for the Right to Be Humiliated." Because it's this process where the more attention that you gain, the bigger the campaign gets, the better that you do in a primary process, and then ultimately when you become the nominee, the more scrutiny and the more pain and humiliation and attention that you invite, and the work gets harder and harder, the stress gets greater and greater, the days get longer and longer. Typically on a campaign, your most senior staff meetings begin around 8 a.m. So if you're on the communications team like I was, you're usually in the office anywhere between 6 and 7 o'clock in order to get ahead of where the news cycle is going for the day, in order to get to that senior staff meeting and plot out how you're going to deal with the income, whatever attacks coming from the campaign, from the opposing campaign, and then also how you're going to manage the candidates' day that day, and whatever media outlets that the candidate's engaging with, how you sharpen your message, how you're making sure that you're managing any of the fallout from any media overnight. And then you really do also have to remember that the campaign is not just about the candidate, but you're also programming every other channel of the campaign. So surrogate network, that is all people that are going out across the country promoting the candidate and their message. The social media platforms that you're engaging in, the digital platform that the campaign is managing. So all of that has to be managed. So it takes a lot of time, and it used to be that we had 3 or 4 news cycles a day back in the old days, before social media really caused an explosion of how these campaigns are covered. And now it's a 24-second news cycle. So every single day you're dealing with mini news cycles. And that's really where the core pressure on the campaign is your most valuable commodity is time.
So it's interesting. So you were in the Bush reelect in 2004, and which was obviously successful, and the Romney campaign in 2012, which was not successful in terms of the ultimate prize. You had an 8-year gap there, although you obviously were involved in between. What was the biggest difference you saw between the Bush campaign? Although I know you were in a more senior position with Romney, but still, you had a significant position there in the Bush campaign. What was the difference?
Well, I'll tell you, there's two big differences. You mentioned the first one, which is, the technological advancement from 2004 to 2012. I also worked on Romney's 2008 campaign. Okay. So I got to see that, these in increments. I worked 3 presidential cycles in a row, which makes it feel, you feel like in those, you live like 20 years of experience in those years. But the technological advancement's one, but I'd say the biggest difference was working on an incumbent campaign where you're working for a sitting president and you're running for re-election. That's like working on an ocean liner. It's big. You have a lot of resources. You're not feeling the waves of the ocean as much, and it's very luxurious compared to when you're working on a 2008, which is an insurgent campaign. And in 2012 as well, where you're going up against an incumbent who is running for re-election. Those are like working on a pirate ship. It's survival every single day. You're living sort of minute to minute off of the land. And it has a very different psychology involved. But I'd say going back to the technological difference, also in 2004, when I was working on that campaign, it was very traditional in the sense that the wires were what drove a lot of the news coverage and is where a lot of people processed most of their information about politics. It wasn't a 24/7, or politics didn't bleed into everything the way it does now, which is politics bleeds into culture, sports, entertainment. That's what happens when you have a president who was, came out of the reality television business. Whereas then politics was a little bit more segmented off. It was something that you did after you got your fix with sports, entertainment, the weather, and culture. And what happened was then it was a little bit more manageable of a pace. So the wires were where information was processed. The cable news networks, 3 or 4 shows that really specialized in politics, and then the broadcast networks and affiliate networks that are around the country. Now it's 24/7. There's 1,000 different mediums that you have to manage. And as a result, the pace is that much faster and the pressure minute to minute on a campaign is that much greater.
If you look at this continuum and you take the term nastiness of the campaigns, so you go from 2004 to 2012, and then if you can even extrapolate it to today, how different is it from when it was when you first got in your first presidential campaign?
Yeah, I think a comparison of anecdotes will help give people an idea. I remember in the 2004 campaign, we had a very tough contrast message with John Kerry, then Senator Kerry. And the contrast message was a polite way of saying we were going out there and making a case to the American people about our worldview versus John Kerry's worldview, and why we had the right direction for the country and he had the wrong direction of the country. And I remember being admonished when I was, going a little bit more negative than usual in one of my interviews or in a quote that I had given by the communications director on the campaign, who said, "Remember, our opponents are not evil. They're just wrong." And that is a big difference in how we're going to persuade the voter out there that's yet to make up their mind. You look at that now, and you look at like the 2016 convention, and the message, one of the key messages and chants coming out of that 2016 convention in Cleveland was "lock her up." And you see people that gravitate to no, this is not just about right or wrong. This is about good versus evil. Where the campaign calls themselves the Death Star. That is a much more animated version of contrast messaging in politics and competing for the persuadable voter than we were used to in those campaigns. Now, a lot of folks that are big supporters of Trump, they'll tell you that's why Romney lost. They'll tell you that's why McCain lost, and they'll tell you that's why George Bush may have been loved at the time, but was never really respected by a lot of folks in the media or his opponents. So it's a very animated debate now about the nature of politics and what's the way to win, and what cost you pay in order to win nowadays in politics.
Okay, so I want to run a theory that I have by you to tell me whether you think that I'm correct or not. My sense has always been if you're an incumbent running for re-election, you want to create what I would call a choice election. You want to basically particularly if you're not very popular, and there have been very few incumbent presidents who are very popular going into a re-elect. I mean, Reagan maybe was the last one who may have been over 50%. But I think that what happens is that, and if you're an insurgent, you're running against an incumbent, you want it to be a referendum on the incumbent. Do you think is that a good way of describing what you would sort of say as the basic notions of how people approach these campaigns?
Yeah, well, I think fundamentally every election is a contest between more of the same or change, and so the referendum versus a choice is a very good way to set that up. I think when you are an incumbent, you do want it to be a choice between your worldview and theirs, and that was exactly the race that we ran in 2004, where when we were running as challengers, or essentially an open seat in 2008, we had a little bit of the burden of being an incumbent because we were replacing a two-term president. Right. And that was why Barack Obama ran such a successful campaign about change. And then ultimately in 2012 was reelected because he forced the question upon voters, who is it of these two candidates, who's on your side? And that's a choice election. And in that case, he edged out Romney in enough states to win and win pretty solidly. And it was still a close race in the sense that it was like 51-48, but he was never behind in that race because we never did actually make the case that it's time to take this in a new direction.
So looking at 2020, if you were advising the Trump campaign, would you be advising them to turn this into a choice election?
What I would say to that, if I was in that strategy room right now, I would say that ultimately every single campaign comes down to is ultimately a contest for the future. So while in the present, we face very, very difficult odds when it comes to how we're dealing with the COVID-19 crisis and how we're dealing with the economic nuclear winter that's coming on the other side of it. That ultimately the case that you have to make to voters out there that have yet to make up their mind on this is that the path forward, you have the right plan for the path forward. I think one of the mistakes that you're seeing right now is that the Trump campaign is pointing to the economic prosperity of the last 2.5 years. And they're saying, we ought to get credit for that. And I think that's a mistake because fundamentally, they're not going to be looking back at a time of crisis like this. And the fundamentals are more likely to drive this campaign than are the atmospherics. And by that, I mean, what we focus on every single day in campaign, oftentimes the minute-by-minute stuff that we see on cable television. What happened at today's press conference? What scandal or outrage of the day are we going to obsess over? What nickname did Trump give to Biden? He's attacking President Obama. He's giving Biden this nickname. Those are the atmospherics, and those ultimately aren't as important right now, particularly in a time of crisis, as the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are GDP, unemployment rate, job growth, or job losses that we have right now, the unemployment rate, things like that. The fundamentals of the economy are what going to decide this race. And so I would focus on the trend line of those fundamentals. So right now we're in a very difficult spot. But can the president start to convince people that we're returning to where we are. We're at least on the path to normalcy, stability, and start to restore people's confidence. That would be the key focus of the message.
Well, do you think that President Trump is temperamentally capable of allowing this campaign to be anything but a referendum on himself?
No, and that's the thing, is that every good strategy is only as good as its candidate and the candidate's willingness to execute it. And I think one of the challenges that you would have with a candidate like President Trump, particularly in a re-election, and particularly in a time of crisis, is that he sort of reacts to the latest 30-minute news cycle, and he thinks more like an executive producer trying to create content for the cable networks that are covering him every single day, or the digital networks that are covering him every single day, than taking the long view. Where do I want this election to be in September and October, so that people are feeling more confident than they are today about the state of the economy and the state of the crisis, and that they're feeling that we've turned normal. If that trend line were to be in his favor, he could still get reelected. But if he starts to react to 30-second news cycle or 30-minute news cycles based on what the host on Fox just said, it will become more and more challenging through this crisis for him to really execute a winning plan.
Okay, so there was a poll out a day or two ago. I forget which one, but I think it was a credible poll. And what it said was, the question was, how is the president handling the crisis, or the government handling the crisis? And 82% of Democrats thought he was doing a terrible job, and 80% of Republicans thought he was doing a good job. Does that surprise you?
No, because I think right now we are just in a very partisan atmosphere. Republicans are from Venus and Democrats are from Mars. And there was an opportunity here not to get full Democratic support, but with any time there's a crisis, there's a rally around the flag effect on the psychology of the American public. And they look to the presidency as a unifier and to bring the country together. And even in the first week or two, with how they dealt with certain governors and states, how they responded to any criticism, where the partisanship was sort of baked into the cake on this. And people who are watching Fox right now, or people who are watching MSNBC, or listening to PR, or reading New York Times, most of them have their mind made up, the partisans. But the big middle is still looking and still looking for some sense of leadership. And I think as a result of the president's more reflexively negative or partisan approach, they're looking to their governors. And if you look at governors that have really look at this crisis as a Democrat and a pragmatist, and saying, what can I do to help solve people's anxieties or soothe people's anxieties? Communicate, work transparently, bring Republicans and Democrats to the table. They're all sitting at 70 to 80% approval ratings right now as a result.
So, and I know this is hard for someone like you being a Republican, but if you put on a Democratic hat, you only have to borrow it for this conversation. What would you be telling the Biden campaign to do?
To put the candidate in bubble wrap and not let him out until after Labor Day. Look, I think when the fundamentals take over a campaign like this, I'm not saying it's a prevent defense, but you have to focus on the fundamentals. And so for them, I think it's communicating what plans they would put in place, and communicating a different message that's that contrasts well with the president, about bringing people together, working towards a solution, and trying to focus on the task at hand, which is getting the country, all of the things that they need to do in order to combat the virus, which is testing, greater protection, working with businesses and workers to get to create a stronger economic safety net, and then focusing on both the security or as it relates to combating the virus, and the security as it relates to rebuilding the economy. And to focus only on that, because those fundamentals are what's going to drive this election. It's ultimately the question about candidates is which one of these candidates understands the problem of people like me. I think right now it's a slight variation. It's which one of these candidates can return me to my normal life and and sort of soothe the anxieties that I have, and fill in the blanks on some of the unknowns about where we're going.
Okay. Adam, do we have any questions that we might throw to Kevin right now?
Yeah, we have one from the audience, and you've spoken on this a little bit, and again, maybe the circumstances we're in right now are a little different than normal, but one of our viewers wants to know how much of a campaign is crisis management versus the actual, stance on key issues, kind of the fundamentals, as you have called them.
It feels like every day there's some crisis, because even if it's not playing out on live on television, it's bubbling up. There's some reporter digging into one issue, or another reporter that is pushing some other thing. You also live with this sort of crisis mentality, because you know that the other campaign has an entire office on their campaign, an entire team on their campaign, pushing opposition research and attacking of very heightened awareness. I would say it like that. But ultimately, this is one thing that I always try to teach communicators when they go out onto campaigns, is that in the communications team, ultimately every campaign hits a crisis. Every single campaign. You may think that you're not going to hit one. You always face a crisis. And ultimately, the communications team becomes the face, voice, and response arm of the campaign. So very rarely does everybody stop and look at the fundraiser on the campaign, the chief fundraiser. Very rarely do they stop and look at the chief volunteer organizer. But at some point, the candidate, the campaign manager, the media, and the public is going to look to the spokesperson, the press secretary, the communications director, and they're going to say, what do we do? And so I think that knowing that, you sort of live with a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs on a campaign.
Sorry, so Kevin, I've long had a theory when it comes to campaigns that about maybe 30% of what you do actually matters, but the problem is you're never sure which 30% it is. So therefore, you do everything that you do. Have things become refined enough now that you have a much better sense of the impact of everything, or is there still a certain amount of, well, we have the resources. If we have the resources, we're going to try, we're going to put 2,000 balloons as opposed to 1,000 balloons because it couldn't hurt.
Yeah, well, I think the only way to gain that knowledge is it has nothing to do with resources or money or anything like that. It's really experience. It's when I think of the stuff that I used to obsess over and worry about and freak out about and waste time on, quite frankly, in my first campaign versus my last campaign, where I had a little bit more, I was like, George Costanza's dad, Serenity Now. I just like, oh, okay. And I remember saying to myself, this happened a couple of times in the 2012 campaign where everybody would get very exercised over whatever the outreach of the day was. And I remember being on campaign calls and in senior staff meetings, and I used to say, all right, let's ask ourselves this question. This is the fundamental question we have to ask ourselves. Does this matter to the person who has yet to make up their mind? Are they going to freak out over some deputy senior assistant advisor that said something wrong in a article or on TV, who's somewhat loosely affiliated with the campaign? Do they even know who that person is or care? No? Well, then we should just take our hit and move on and focus on the big message of the day. What is it that a President Romney can do to move this country in the right direction? And that is what we should be focusing on. So, but the only way to really learn that is to make all the mistakes about sweating it out on the little petty stuff in your first campaign, and by your third campaign, it's kind of like I talk about it with like being fatherhood. when my first child swallowed a quarter, I took him to the emergency room. When my third child swallowed a quarter, I took it out of their allowance.
Okay, very good. Adam, you got another question for us?
Yeah, kind of on that same note. Somebody wants to know, when you are heading up a campaign, you're the official spokesperson and representing this presidential candidate. What kind of questions are you asking them, or like what would you need from them on a day-to-day basis to be able to do your job as best you could in any given situation?
That is a great question, and it's really the most important part of being a communicator on a campaign is developing that 100% full bond of trust with the candidate, so that you can ask them the tough questions and they can give you the unvarnished truth. That way you have the level of control and the knowledge and the command of an issue that you need in order to answer it effectively as their public surrogate. And the campaigns and the candidates that hold stuff back from senior staff and don't develop that level of trust, they always, like I said earlier, every campaign faces a crisis. And when those campaigns face that crisis, they ultimately never recover from them because you don't have that bond of trust. And, we probably use terms like the military terms too loosely in campaign politics because it's not the same thing. But when you hear people say, that's somebody you want in your foxhole, or that's somebody that you can trust on your watch, a lot of it has to do with that bond and that development of candid exchange of ideas and trust. Because there's going to be times where you're sitting in a strategy room where the candidate has a really bad idea, and if you don't speak up and be like and say, I think that's a terrible idea and here's why, you could have to go out and promote a really bad strategy, and that's no fun, and it's bad for the campaign. And if you don't have that exchange of ideas, good ideas don't find their way through. The campaigns that I've worked on where people sort of used information as a commodity or managed the candidate and kept the candidate cloistered away from staff, they all had tough outcomes. The ones where you had that strong that level of candor and trust, they're all at least much better to work on. So they didn't all win, trust me. They don't all win. I had a very good bond of trust and candor with Governor Romney, but we unfortunately didn't make it all the way.
So let me ask this question: in the role of spokesman of a campaign, describe what relationship do you need to have with the media, and particularly because you're dealing with them on a regular basis, and particularly because some of them are writing or shooting things that really, really annoy you.
Yeah. Well, I've always thought it's important to develop relationships off the record, and gain a better understanding of what it is that reporters are writing, how they're writing, what they're looking for, how they like to report, read their stories, talk to them about their craft. So, when I was working the vineyards as a young press secretary, I did a lot of that. If you have conversations where 80% of the time you're not really on the record, you're just exchanging information, learning about what they've learned on their beat, you can really develop strong relationships. And then I also had a very upfront relationship with reporters in the sense that I used to say to them all the time, I used to say, you think you can run a better campaign, and I think I can write a better news story. So as long as we get that out of the way now,
right,
let's be arbiters of information and truth as best we can. My job is, with passion and prejudice, is to get the candidate that I care about elected president, or elected mayor, city council, Congress, you name it. And that's my job. And so, but I want to offer you all the information I can that you need to do that job. And I won't lie to you, and I won't tell you that I know something that I don't. And I also won't tell you when when I do know something, but I can't tell you that I can't tell you versus lie and pretend. So I think being that arbiter of the truth, developing that relationship and reputation is probably most important. I like to think that reporters, they always knew that I was dealing with them with the truth and the facts in mind, and that I had a great respect for what they were trying to do as reporters. but that there was a healthy balance, that they had their agenda and I had mine.
You know, it reminds me of a story Jim Lake told me. Jim was the spokesman on the Reagan campaign back in 1980, when he said a press secretary's job is to have the press think they are 50% theirs and the candidate knows they're 100% theirs.
Yes, that's exactly right.
That's right. Let's go to another question. And Adam?
Sure. One of our viewers wants to know, will growing partisanship make third-party candidates more or less appealing or viable?
Well, I always like to quote my friend Paul Begala, the Democratic strategist on this. He taught me this lesson a long time ago, and it's absolutely true, which is that third parties are kind of like bees. They sting and then they die. I do think that there's a growing sense of frustration with both parties, but the organization that needs to be there to build a national party to actually to be able to build the sort of farm team that you need in order to have national candidates and really run candidates state by state, I think that's pretty tough. And I think Libertarian Party, Green Party, I think they'll always be, they will tend to have play on the margins at the fringes, but that there's very little hope right now, I think, that they're able to continue to grow into a party that would rival the organizational power and the interest that there is, the partisan interest that there is in being members of the two biggest parties, Democrats and Republicans.
Another question, Adam. Go ahead.
Yeah. Someone wanted to know, with the effects of COVID, how would you campaign today if you were on one, without face-to-face rallies? What would be your strategy?
Yeah, without going into too many details and examples, I think it's just you have to move from a traditional platform to a digital and virtual platform. So I'd be using as many of the online opportunities and platforms as I could. I think you're seeing Biden do that. I think he's a little bit behind because they didn't expect this, and there's some muscle memory that comes with building a campaign like that. But I think also advertising and being able to drive messages. If you have to spend fewer resources on things like rallies and events, you can spend more of your resources on doing longer form content from your campaign and turn your campaign into essentially a publisher, and constantly program to your audience of supporters, as well as the audiences out there that you can then identify through those online platforms as potential persuadable voters. And so I'd be doing a lot more of that. I think the Trump campaign, because they're an incumbent campaign, they have a lot more of these well-developed platforms. So you see them out there. They're doing podcasts. They're broadcasting on their websites. They're using Facebook and other social media platforms to really constantly program messages to their audience. And then in the meantime, at the same time, identify where their persuadable opportunities are out there.
So Kevin, as the number of infections and deaths total continues to rise in the United States, the efforts by the president and some of his supporters seem to be, well, maybe those numbers aren't quite right. Maybe those numbers are inflated. Do you think that has any traction? Do you think it means anything, or is that just sort of a throwing something to the base?
I think it's designed to sort of juice the base. I think, actually, let me back up. I think the president really does believe that. That's the key, which is that so much of this has nothing to do with strategy, and a lot of it has to do with the president's instincts. And then the organization around him then kicks in to sort of offer an echo chamber to those instincts or those thoughts. And that's really what that is. I think it only motivates the base, and you have a bunch of people arguing who have already made up their mind. And the folks in the big middle, if you take the biggest swing states in this election, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, North Carolina, you draw a 25 mile radius around the biggest cities there. That's the whole ballgame. Now, if you have a voter who's yet to make up their mind in one of those areas, the numbers on COVID are not necessarily what are driving them. It's more about the anxieties about the economic impact of it that's going to matter with their vote.
Okay. Adam, you got another question?
Yeah, and kind of on that same topic, talking about an increasingly partisan nation, on campaigns, either in your experience or if you think it's happening more now, are the campaigns more about ensuring a turnout from the base, or is it about persuading the people in the middle?
Well, it depends. It really does. But I think every campaign comes into a campaign with a strategy of 50+1, right? Like, how is it that I can get half of the electorate, and then build on that with that +1. And but it also depends on. I think much more of it has to do with where they're looking to drive up margins in particular battleground states as it relates to the electoral math. So, right now, I think the battle for this in this election will come down to a couple of demographic trends. First is the 2018 election, where Republicans, who had normally enjoyed strong support in suburbs, particularly with college-educated women, they got overwhelmed by those voters in 2018 and need to at least win some of them back in order to manage the margins. The other is older voters. If you look at the margins that Trump had with voters over 55, they were a big part of how he won these battleground states that we just mentioned, places like Arizona, and then the blue wall of Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So older voters there, where he previously enjoyed double-digit support, he's now a couple of votes down to Biden in some of the recent public polls. So that's a big problem. And then lastly is the high school educated women in some of these rural areas. Traditionally, their male counterparts have had to bleed a little bit. And so if Trump were to keep his same position right now, he'd have a tough time winning on election day. Those have to be big core concerns for the Trump campaign right now.
Okay, one more question, Adam. You got one handy?
Yeah. Speaking of demographics, specifically with regard to age, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are much older than some previous presidents. And why do you think this shift has happened? Why haven't some younger candidates, maybe specifically in the Democratic Party, had as much traction? And do you think this is a trend that will continue, or is there something that needs to happen? Because that is a concern for a lot of people, both Donald Trump and Joe Biden's age.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it had anything to do with the profile of their age. I mean, the fact that Buttigieg came from nowhere and did something was, I think, a testament to some of the strength that younger voters have. But one of the things about that primary campaign was that I think reflexively some of the candidates got caught up in a Twitter bubble and also a activist bubble, in that they constantly seemed to be throwing away a bigger arc of their message that was focused on working class economics and concerns about energy, concerns about security. And they tried to have this, there was almost as if this woke primary was taking place on the side. And they all tried to sort of out-progressive one another, right? Or tried to sort of, micro-issue their way, or micro-target their way issue by issue to becoming the sort of more liberal, hip candidate. And what happened was the larger electorate that's not on Twitter and that really is less vocal than the most vocal activists are a little bit more moderate, a little bit more centrist, a little bit more pragmatic. And that was where I think the Biden campaign ended up. I think they were oftentimes very baited into the sort of woke candidate thing, and it didn't suit Biden. And his worst days were when he tried to be like those other candidates and tried to get to the left of them. And if you think about how he won, it was essentially presenting himself as an alternative to a Bernie Sanders candidacy that was seen as out of the mainstream. And so I think that's the lesson for a lot of future candidates, which is don't get caught up in the day-to-day noise of a campaign. Instead, focus on the fundamentals of where the Democratic electorate, even those that aren't as vocal online are. And that's a better, I think that's you can piece together a bigger, broader coalition to help win the Democratic primary.
So, well, let's talk about the question that, of course, is starting to bubble up now. I guess it's bubbled up quite a bit already, and that is, of course, the vice presidential pick for Biden. He's committed to putting a woman on the ticket. First of all, who do you think he should pick to help him? And secondly, who do you think he will pick?
Yeah. I think, for the mood of the country right now, I would say that Amy Klobuchar had as strong a message for people who are looking for a bit more of an optimistic view of the country and its direction, a bit more of a pragmatic, centrist approach to solving problems, but with all the authenticity of somebody who is a progressive and has, fought on democratic issues for a long time. So I was very impressed with her ability to, talk to Democratic constituencies, but also at the same time, really sort of offer some outreach to maybe a lot of those nose holders that aren't favorable to the sort of Trump view of the Republican Party and could maybe be swung. And many of those, I think, are the ones that live in that 25-mile radius around Maricopa County or Milwaukee or Detroit or Charlotte. And they could be a big difference maker. I think the mistake would be to choose a VP who is not really ready, who doesn't really pass that sort of threshold test, which is, could you see somebody as president of the United States? Because I think with Biden and his age, that question is much more prominent in people's thinking. So I think Elizabeth Warren, because she's a little bit older and because she really does invite the ire of even many moderate Republicans, could be problematic. And then the rest, I think, all have, they've gone through one campaign or primary campaign where they're rather new to the national scene, and so they may not have the same level of experience to endure what it's like to be the number two on a national ticket. And so that would be, I think that's going to factor very prominently. You see a lot of people pushing Stacey Abrams, for example, and while she, I think, is supported by a number of Democratic activists, if I were them, I would have some concerns that somebody who didn't win their own home state, though that is debated by a lot of activists, would really do as well on a national ticket.
Yeah, it seems to me that what Biden has to accomplish here is what John McCain did not accomplish, which essentially is to have someone that people can look at and say, yeah, I could see that person as president. Maybe not my first choice, but it sort of passes the straight face test. And the problem with Stacey Abrams, I think, and I like Stacey Abrams a lot, is that a lot of people would sort of go, well, what does she do? Who is she? And while she's articulate, I think it would be more of a problem. And my gut instinct is he's going to go with, if you ran for president, if you were Amy Klobuchar or Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris, you've been vetted.
Yeah.
Because every opponent of yours and that was looking for every lousy thing they could find about you, and they were feeding it to someone.
Yeah, and the vetting thing, I think, is important. I remember, I'll never forget a phone call I got from a reporter right after Sarah Palin was named as the VP pick in 2008, and they said, "Well, what's your big worry here?" And I said, "Well, we've got 2 months to sort of fill in the blanks, and my worry is that they fill in the blanks before we do."
Right. And
the other thing too was that, and this was a little bit of a scary anecdote, but I remember when the McCain campaign ran a surrogate call where they brought a lot of people on to sort of, give them the message and talking points about the choice and why. That way, those of us that were heading out to cable television had a little bit more of an informed view about what the campaign was saying. And like 3 or 4 times, the person who was doing the briefing mispronounced Palin's name as Palin. So I'm like, you have people that are on the campaign who don't even know the candidate's name, briefing people about how great she is. Like, that's a problem.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Adam, give me another question.
Yeah, we have one coming from Facebook Live. It says, Kevin keeps referring to the big middle. This is something that I have believed exists, but there are smart sociologists who argue anywhere from the middle is dwindling to the middle is a myth. Do you have any thoughts about whether what they say is true?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I always refer to it as the big middle just because there's a lot of people in there that say that they are in the middle, but really they have very partisan tendencies. So when you see people say, well, 26% of the electorate, or I forget what the number is now, is registered as independents, really only about 7 to 8% of them are true independents that kind of go back and forth. Most of them are independents who tend to vote Republican, or independents who have historically voted Democrat. But the reason that I call it the big middle is I still believe with the right campaigns, they are movable. They are more persuadable than the true partisans who have totally made up their minds, and they watch politics the way I watch baseball, which is that Yankees versus Red Sox. It's like, it's if you want to understand politics nowadays, wear a Red Sox jersey and sit in the bleachers in the Bronx. You'll learn what it's like to be an MSNBC viewer at Fox.
But so let's go a little further down that particular road, because it's all one of my thoughts on all of this is that given the profile of the president, it seems to me that there are even fewer people who are persuadable this time around than there have been in the past. What do you think?
I think that in this, if we talk about just the environment, the political environment, before Corona crisis, I'd say that was right. But I think because of this, before the crisis hit, people used to ask me all the time, they used to say, what is it that's going to get people really Republican diehards to not support this guy? Like, what is it that's going to make them sort of quote unquote, there's a lot of people who would ask me this question were critics. So when are they going to wake up? And I'd say really the only thing that will shift his, floor of support will be an economic crisis. And I think right now could say that we're on the verge of that. If you look at we are in the middle of that. If you look at the last the last jobs report, where we have double-digit unemployment, and we have something close to 30 to 35 million people out of work just in the last 2 months. That is not going to go away overnight. So that crisis will be from here all the way to Election Day. And it very well may people whose partisan stripes used to be what we used to call Fifth Avenue Republicans, which is that they would vote for Trump even if he shot somebody on Fifth Avenue. It may move enough of them where it makes a big difference in this election.
Do you think that Biden is the kind of candidate that some of them would move to?
Well, the thing about Biden is that, and this is why I think he's a tough candidate to run against. He has his weaknesses, no doubt. But one of the things that makes it tough to run against him is that he has a 35 to 40 year profile a profile that's been built over 35 to 40 years as a likable, centrist moderate. Now, there are advertising campaigns where they're going to say he was, a bunch of people will spend money saying that he was very liberal on this issue, and then a bunch of people that will say he was, too conservative or outside the mainstream for progressives on this issue. But for the most part, he's very identifiable, and there's not much of an X factor with him. And he also, I think one of the key things that differentiates him from Hillary Clinton is that he does not invite the ire of so many Republicans or independents the way Hillary Clinton did, which is that there's no way they could vote for her. And that is a strength in that he's very different from the last Democratic candidate that either maybe people stayed home and didn't go out and support because they didn't like, or they voted for the other guy because they were going to vote for anybody but Hillary Clinton.
I remember near the several weeks out of the 2016 campaign, And the polls were showing at one point that Trump's Republican support was like in the mid 70s, mid to high 70s. And I kept saying, well, if that holds, he's obviously going to lose and lose badly. And in the end, obviously, they all came home. Republicans all came home.
Yeah.
Now, this time you look at the numbers, and they're starting out at home. I mean, he's got 85 to 90% of the Republicans right now. Do you think that his handling of the coronavirus, the economy, all the other kinds of things, offers an opportunity for Biden to bleed any of that off? Or are we at a point where fundamentally he's wearing my jersey and that's all that matters?
So to your earlier point about some of the metrics that, or some of the numbers that were driving the 2016 campaign, one of the other ones that really was so surprising, and if you really want to know why everybody got it wrong in 2016 when they predicted that that Trump wouldn't win and Hillary Clinton would, the big number was inside his own support. One fifth of his voters said that he wasn't fit to be president. Now, in any other campaign that anybody who's ever worked on one, covered one, voted in, that number, that one fifth of voters, they usually don't stay. They usually stay home. So they say, yeah, I like Trump because I don't like Clinton, but I really don't think he's fit for office. They usually don't go to the polls. This time they did. They went out and voted, and that was why he surprised so many people, because the numbers that people had never seen that before. But to your point, we don't know that yet, but that is the key to the potential Biden win, which is that the president's numbers, 85% is probably not good enough. It needs to be above 90, closer to 95% amongst his most ardent supporters. If it starts to dip, if it starts to go to 85% or below, remember that this is all going to come down to about 350,000 voters across about 3 or 4 states. That's the margin of victory right there.
Adam, you got another question?
Yeah, as we approach 7 o'clock, I have two ones that are a little different. The first one is someone wants to know if they wanted to get involved in elections, whether that's local or state or federal, what is like the best place to start? How do you do that maybe coming in cold? And then another question, and this is quite different, I'm just lumping them together for time. Do you think that Mitt Romney is going to run for president again at some point? And if he did,
let me answer that last one. No.
You think no?
You know, the thing that people keep asking that about is, I don't think he could get through a primary in this Republican Party, right? But the reason people keep asking about it is because I don't know if anybody can see me very well on this on the screen, but I'm 48. He looks exactly like me, and he's 80. I think he's 73. I mean, so he looks like he's 48, even though he's in his mid 70s, close to mid 70s. So they'll keep asking that question because of the clean living life that he's had. But I don't see it, and I think he knows that, and I think he really likes being a senator right now too. But every senator wakes up and looks in the mirror and they see a president looking back. But I just don't think that he'll ever run again. The first question was, how do you get involved in campaigns? Really, it's pick somebody that you really care about, because their campaigns are a chore if you're working on one where you don't believe in the candidate, and be willing to do anything. And when you're willing to do whatever it is on the campaign, which is, are you willing to put up lawn signs? Are you willing to go out and canvass for signatures? Are you willing to go out and write letters, email people, knock on doors, organize other folks, like-minded folks? Whatever you're willing to do, if you do it really well, you will get another job. So, if you go into a campaign, I always tell the story about Joe Kilday, who worked on the 2004 campaign. He showed up one day as a volunteer on the Bush Cheney campaign, and we didn't have anything for him to do, but he looked like a guy who wanted to help. So we put him in a cubicle, and we turned the TV on, and we said, watch cable news. If anything happens, email everybody in the campaign. And he was the guy who was watching the television when John Kerry said, I voted for that before I voted against it. And I remember him sending that around to everybody. And, we turned it into an ad in the space of 48 hours. I think within about a month, Joe Kilday was war room manager of the campaign. and he had his own office with about 18 televisions and about 12 staff. So he went from guy in the cubicle watching television to war room manager of a presidential reelection, all in the space of 3 months. That was because he was willing to do whatever. So if you go out in a campaign, they ask you to lick envelopes, get signatures, and you do it really well, it's a meritocracy. You'll move up in the campaign, and it's pretty rewarding, particularly when you work for somebody that you really support and that you believe in.
Okay, so I'm going to throw one other question to you and sort of discuss with you a thought that I have. Let's suppose, do you think it's possible that this time around, that if Trump sort of hits his head at 43, 44, 45%, that he can't quite get past that this is a possibility that for the Democrats, 2020 is like it was for the Republicans in 1980 when Reagan beat Carter? As you're too young to remember this, but Reagan and Carter were very close in the polls until the weekend before the election, when suddenly Carter's support just evaporated in key places. Reagan won, I think it was 8 or 9 points that won that election. And
Anderson took about 7 or 8% too, right?
I'm sorry?
Anderson took about 7.
Yeah, I understand that amount. But Anderson had sort of been at that point. Carter and Reagan had been about 45. But then what happened was also the Democrats lost a half a dozen Senate seats, most of which they had not counted on losing. You see something like that as a possibility on the horizon? I don't see a
big fundamental shift. Instead, I see a very possibility that we come down to the wire with the Senate. If you were to look at some of the numbers today, North Carolina, Maine, they all favor Democrats. They slightly favor Democrats. So, and then you have Georgia is becoming increasingly competitive. I still feel like that's one where it's a little bit more out of reach than at least right now. I'm not convinced that it'll be there in the fall. But those are right. Like those are problematic numbers for Republicans. So where it's something like 13 seats, no, I don't see that. I think these campaigns are really well run nowadays. The intensity of partisan support for keeping the Senate, it's just a much bigger factor in a lot of these Senate races than it was in 1984 or 1980. So I feel like I don't see you're not going to see a very big shift, but instead, the Senate majority is at risk right now.
Okay.
And Mitch McConnell always runs like that. That's the thing. He's like Mitch McConnell always says like, maps and demographics don't win campaigns. Candidates do.
And I think that what we've got is the one thing that I think generally happens is both in the swing states in the presidential election and close Senate races, they never break 50-50.
Yeah.
Almost always break, the vast majority one way or the other. And that's why the question to me is that if Biden can win this race by 4 or 5 or 6 points, it seems to me that the Democrats in a number of those close Senate races, it probably drifts their way too.
Yeah. I'd say my biggest worry is as we draw closer to this election and we maybe have election protocols that are not as locked down as they need to be in states, that the validity of the results starts to come into question. And we have democratic instability in our institutions that we're managing for the next year, 2 years. And we've always been the beacon of hope around the world because of peaceful transitions of power here. And that's something that we have to keep our eye on.
I think that's right. So with that, you get the last word. And I want to thank you very much for coming. As always, it's a pleasure to be able to talk with you and to listen to what you have to say. I think all of our folks appreciate the perspective that you bring. And I want to thank you personally and on behalf of American Public Square.
Yeah.
For any of our listeners, I want to add that tomorrow we're going to have there'll be a podcast out we recorded today with Lee Norman, who's the Secretary of Health for Kansas, and he has some interesting observations on the virus and how it's affecting our area here. Once again, for everybody here, Kevin, let me thank you very much. Adam, anything else we need to add here?
Thanks, Alan. And again, thank you, Kevin. Excellent discussion. I can tell, we had a lot of questions coming in. People really enjoyed this, so thank you for your insight. So I'd like to also just quickly thank all of our supporters who tuned in tonight. After this event ends, a very short 2-minute survey will pop up. We would appreciate if you would take some time to fill that out. That really helps us improve our programming, figure out what we're doing right and what we could be doing better. And most of all, thank you to all you viewers for your support of American Public Square at Jewell. We believe that now more than ever, our mission to improve the tone and quality of public discourse is vital to this community and our nation at large, especially at a time when we are have social distancing. We still need to find a way to come together and have these important conversations. If you appreciate what we do and you want to keep supporting these programs, I urge you to go to our website, which is just www.americanpublicsquare.org, and become a member. There's lots of benefits to it, so please check out our website. If you have any questions, please contact us through our website or social media on our Facebook or Twitter, Instagram. With that, I want to say once again, Mr. Madden, thank you. Alan, thanks for moderating this. I hope everyone has a safe and healthy spring. Good night.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Look forward to seeing everybody in person sometime soon.
Thanks a million, Kevin.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Bye-bye.
See you.